Appropriate testimony tonight. The oath is one of those things that we will have to look at before too long in Christian ethics and truthfulness. John chapter 7 is where we're going to be tonight. We're going to have to read, first of all, the context of this passage. We left you with this last Sunday morning in Christian ethics. We're going to have to understand the context before we can really interpret the ethical scene that some people see presented here. Now, I can't really ask you which way that you think that it should go. And by the way, I think our last statement was that the little word yet, Y-E-T, is the big word in this phrase in John chapter 7 and verse 8. Whether the yet should be there or shouldn't be there, if it should, then how do we have the alternative, or vice versa, if it shouldn't, then how do we have the alternative? And whether it should or shouldn't, how does that fit the context of the passage? It would probably be unfair to ask you to raise your hands yea or nay, A or B on that, because you have to know a lot of other things which go into this passage to be able to interpret it properly. Let's start reading in chapter 7 and verse 1, John's Gospel. And my paper has, I think we go from page 32 and a half to 36 and a half. So that's 4 full pages that are devoted. And I hope we can probably do all of this tonight as we breeze our way through this. 4 full pages devoted to this one issue of John 7:8. Everything revolving around this little word yet. Everything revolves around that. When he said, I go not up to this feast, or when he said, I go not up yet to this feast, then it makes all the difference in the world how we're going to interpret this. It's one of the most difficult of the passages that we have to deal with on the surface. Whether it really appropriately fits under this 4th point of clarification, truth is compatible with change, will be something that we'll see as we go along. I've heard preachers explain it in different ways, and someone in the church, well, more than one person, has come up and asked me about this particular verse. I'm sad to say some of those people that have asked me about it are no longer here, but that was their own choice. But I know on May the 5th, this has been just about 2 years ago, on lit tapes 44 and 45, we taught those tapes. We had a love feast after that, right here, on a Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon. And one of those people who is no longer here came up and asked me, well, how do we deal with John 7:8? And I said, well, we'll get to that. That was under, I think, characteristics of ethics, where he dealt with untruthfulness in the Old Testament and lies in the lives of Old Testament people, which I think that you were supposed to hear as we got going into this section as well. And I said we'd cover that in the future. Well, see, that's been 2 years ago. 2 years later in the future. Those people aren't here to find out what the answer is, but the rest of you are. After this, Jesus went around in Galilee, purposely staying away from Judea because of the Jews who were waiting to take his life. When the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles, now most of John's feasts, and he deals with several places where the term or the concept of feast comes up, most of those deal with Passover. The chronology of John's Gospel seems to be built around the appearance of Passover feasts. And so the appearance of a Feast of Tabernacles is a little bit unusual here. And this is what the whole setting of this 7th chapter is. For instance, when we get down into, verses 37 through 39, if you'll look with me there, which are verses that charismatics are generally familiar with. To really interpret this, we would have to have some understanding, and a lot of this can be gained, by the way, from Josephus' writings, some understanding of the liturgy and of the ceremonies of the Feast of Tabernacles as it was celebrated the first half of the 1st century A.D. The last and greatest day of the feast, and this is still Feast of Tabernacles. That was a many-day feast, remember. Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the Scripture has said, streams of living water will flow from within him. By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. We know that would happen in Acts 2. Up to that time, the Spirit had not yet been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. Now this is the same feast. This whole section here is dealing with it. And it goes all the way into, I think, verse 51 or 52, way to the very end of the chapter, dealing with Feast of Tabernacles. So remember that, because that's going to become crucial to our understanding of this context, and particularly verse 8, the meaning of this as we go along. So remember, John's Gospel seems to be based chronologically around Passover feasts. Whether there's 3 or 4 is really debatable because of an obscure verse back in chapter 5, but it's still based around that. And so unlike John, we have an appearance of Feast of Tabernacles. And I know there's Feast of Lights over in chapter 10 as well. We discussed that earlier, but it's just by mention there, and it's not a whole chapter devoted to it. Jesus' brothers said to him, "You ought to leave here, Galilee, and to go to Judea." We're just told why he has not been in Judea. The Jews were trying to take his life. "So that your disciples may see the miracles that you do." Now that doesn't mean the apostles, those disciples, because they went with him wherever he went. So if he were in Galilee, and obviously being there he'd be doing miracles as well, then those disciples, the apostles, would be seeing that. But they mean disciples that are native to Judea. Most of the apostles came from Galilee, remember. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. That's probably just quoting a proverb, and it's just, obvious wisdom there, that no one who wants to be well known does things in secret. That'd be a contradiction. They think that what Jesus wants, he's claiming to be Messiah, well, that would be well-known figure. And so they said, well, there's no way to become well-known in secret, especially up in Galilee, a place despised by the Jews living in Judea and Jerusalem. "Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world." For even his own brothers did not believe in him, not until after the resurrection. Therefore Jesus told them, "The right time for me has not yet come. For you any time is right. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that what it does is evil. You go to the Feast of Tabernacles," is understood. "I am not yet going up to this feast, because for me the right time has not yet," another yet appearance, "come." And having said this, he stayed in Galilee. However, after his brothers had left for the feast, he went also. And so you have the interesting juxtaposition of these verses, 8 and 9, juxtaposed with verse 10. "I go not," and then right away he goes, not publicly, but in secret, to maintain John's clandestine background. And now at the feast, the Jews were watching for him and asking, "Where is that man?" Now this verse has presented a lot of problems for a lot of people. And as I say, I've heard preachers explain it in various ways. Dr. Freeman was very prone. People had brought this up to him and made him aware of it, and he was very prone to jump on the term "yet" and make a big deal about that and kind of have the last laugh on them by saying, well, these people didn't read carefully enough, because after all, we should have that word "yet" underlined, because Jesus said, "I'm not yet going up to the feast." And therefore he would be within his perfect rights to a few days later go up, because "yet" would imply I am going, but not right now. I'll go sometime in the future. That's why we would have a term like "yet." But, of course, people who just jump on a term like that because it's found, may have a King James or a New International version of the Bible theology, just based on what you have here and not go any past that. So remember, we're on our fourth point of clarification, that truth is compatible with a change of intention, a change of behavior, a change of action. Now, whether this passage really fits under this clarification is another matter. We'll come to an answer on that by the time that we're through. But obviously, since on the surface we would include the word "yet," and on the surface we would understand Jesus to be saying here, I'm going to change my behavior here in a few moments or in a few days. I'm not going yet up to this feast, with the implication being that I shall soon go. So truth would be compatible with change. And if that's all there is to it, we have no problem here. Truth is compatible with change. He didn't say, I'm not going to the feast, or I'm never going to go. He said, I'm not going yet, at this time, which would mean he could change his mind later on. We'd have no problem at all. But it's a question of whether the word yet should really be there. If it should appear there, no problem. He just changed his mind later on. If it shouldn't appear there, well, maybe a problem, maybe not. By far, this is the most difficult passage of this category. Whether or not it really fits in this category will be seen later, but from the reading in some translations, it must be dealt with now. Before we can look, I'm going to try to break this down enough so you can get some notes, so I don't have to teach 1, 2, 3, 4 as such, because all this is just written in narrative paragraph style in my paper. But you'll catch it as we go along. Before we can look at what various commentators have written and study the passage for ourselves, that's doing two different things, we do need to deal with it textually, because there are two very important variants here. So this is where you want to begin in your notes. We want to begin textually with John 7:8. This is one of the primary passages where the codices Aleph and Vaticanus 01 and 03 do not, capital N-O-T, agree. Now remember, those are two very important, now they're not inspired, but there are very important early witnesses to the text of the New Testament. There are two codices that date from somewhere, perhaps in the middle of the 4th century A.D. Now, we have pieces of papyrus that date even earlier. But these are two of our great codices. And generally, they're reliable, and especially when they agree with one another. If we've got, in other words, yet in both Aleph and Vaticanus, it would almost solve the matter right away. Now, that's not 100% of the time true. There are a few occasions where they do agree, and yet they're wrong. If they both leave out the word, omit the word yet, 95% of the time, or maybe higher, that would solve the matter. But our first point is the following, that this is one of the primary passages where these two notable, early, reliable Greek codices, witnesses to the text of the New Testament, dating from the mid-4th century A.D., do not, capital N-O-T, agree. 01 and 03. According to the critical apparatus of the standard Greek New Testaments, a further look into the opinions of the major editors and a comparison of frequently used Bible translations, the evidence is as follows. Okay, whether you started with A and B's or 1s and 2s and just continue breaking down your own outline. I'm on a number 1 in parentheses here, but that's because it's based on my whole outline in this paper. Okay, let's start up front and I'll show you what we're going to have to do. Never tell what you get up here. It's always better than Christmas morning. So we'll just say we're going to start with a 1. 2 pointed for you. That's an O, by the way. Don't write the second one here. Because you'll be out of order in your outline then. Okay, we start then with the variant not, that yet should not be here. All we have is I do not go to this feast. I am not going to this feast. Uk, O-U-K, is just a Greek word for not. It's just a negative word. There are other words for not or no in Greek, but this is one. Uk. Okay, here's our support, our manuscript support, our support from the early versions, our support from the early church writers, our support from the, in this order, from the modern textual critics, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, our support from modern translations. Okay, let's start with the manuscripts. You follow me thus far? We got to go right through this textually and come to some understanding, and it makes all the difference in the world whether we should have just not uk or whether we should have upo, not yet. And there we have our important word yet. We still have our negative. The OU is a negative. We still have our negative, but it's not totally negative. I'm not going up to this feast. Just not, uk, O-U-K, but O-U-P-O, upo, I'm not yet going to this feast. So let's start with uk. Let's start with our evidence from the manuscripts. All right, Aleph, you would mark down for this. Now there's one of the weighty ones, but obviously Vaticanus will be on the opposite side. Vaticanus will be down with upo. Uk is not, upo is not yet. D, K, pi, to follow the popular pronunciation. It goes through our codices. Remember, Tischendorf gives us our Aleph. He discovered that and thought it was so important that it ought to be mentioned separately by Hebrew designation. Then we go into our English alphabet. Then we go into our Greek alphabet. Once that's exhausted, then you go into Arabic or just regular English numerals that are prefixed with a 0. We won't do that. We'll go into the minuscules then. 1071, 1079, 1241, 1242, and 1546. So in other words, what you would have, just to show you, what you would have under that, this would be under uk now, would be your Aleph, D, K, your pi, and then your numbers, 1, 0, 7, 1, and so forth. We're going from the codices up into the minuscules. Then we come to our early versions, the Vulgate, as I am not going to this feast. And remember, the problem is the next 2 verses later, after his brothers went, then he went. So he lied. Armenian, Ethiopic, Georgian, various old Latin manuscripts, various Syriac, and Coptic, Egyptian manuscripts with Coptic, quotations from the Diatessaron, that's the 2nd century harmony of the Gospels, remember. Quotations from the Diatessaron, but of course we don't have the Diatessaron today, which are preserved in the Syriac text of Ephraim's commentary. All this we've dealt with earlier in biblical literature, what all these things mean, these technical details, what they mean. Quotations from the Diatessaron in the Syriac text of Ephraim's commentary. E-P-H-R-A-E-M, a different way of spelling Ephraim. E-P-H-R-A-E-M. Then we have it in Porphyry. Now, I don't think we've ever discussed Porphyry around here, and he's the one who's really going to become important. He was an early heretic in the church. He was a Syrian, and he was an opponent of some of the early church writers, as Faustus was to Augustine. In other words, he tried to jump into the Old and New Testament and show moral inconsistencies in the lives of Old Testament saints, New Testament apostles, yes, Christ himself, and try to invalidate the Christian or the biblical, the Judeo-Christian religion and worldview, because we found moral inconsistencies in these places. And one of the moral inconsistencies he found was in John 7:8, where Christ told a lie, where he said that he was not going to the feast, and he turned right around and did go to the feast later. So Porphyry, P-O-R, he has a strange name, P-O-R-P-H-Y-R-Y, Porphyry. P-O-R, that's worse than my name, P-H-Y-R-Y, porphyry, porphyry. As quoted in Jerome, we don't really have the extant writings of Porphyry, but we know what his arguments were because Jerome did some arguing against him in his writings, and so he'd quote some of the Porphyries and then defend what he felt to be the biblical view. So Porphyry, as quoted in Jerome, Epiphanius, a lot of these names you grew familiar with back when we did a study of canonicity. We looked at which writers referred to which books of the New or Old Testament. Cyril and Chrysostom. Cyril and Chrysostom. Now we're still under Ook. That gets us through two categories. The early manuscripts, whether we're talking about codices or minuscules, the majuscules and the minuscules, and it gets us through the early church writers. Then still under this, we come to a third grouping, modern textual critics that are opting for the omission of yet in John 7:8. Modern textual critics would be the following list. Weiss, W-E-I-S-S. We study these names under textual criticism. Tregelles, you remember his name? Tischendorf. Godet, G-O-D-E-T. He wrote numerous commentaries on books like Luke, I believe he has a well-known commentary on Luke. Meyer has a whole commentary set on the whole New Testament, M-E-Y-E-R. And Robertson, A.T. Robertson, famous professor of Greek at Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, wrote a Greek grammar and word pictures in the New Testament, a 5-volume set, and all of this. And then fourthly, another group of witnesses, modern translations. Modern translations which opt for the omission of yet. Therefore, they opt in favor of ook, plain ook, not. Modern translations, Moffat. Oh, I'll tell you what, we need to divide modern translations up into two categories. But you can list them and then I'll tell you what they are. Moffat, New American Bible, and New American Standard Bible. Those three together. Now here's what makes them different from the ones I'm going to give you here in a moment. They give not, right in the text, I am not going to the feast, and give no alternatives anywhere in the marginalia. So you're not even clued into the fact that there may be another reading here, as you are in the NIV, for instance. They give you not yet in the text, and give you an alternative reading in the marginalia, which is found in the footnotes of this edition of the NIV. So Moffat, the New American Bible, the New American Standard Bible, just have not, with no clues that there may be an alternative reading. Then the following versions, we're still under modern translations. These following translations give not, right in the text, just as Moffat, the NAB, the NASB, but then in a footnote give not yet. So they're at least cluing us in that there are two alternatives here. Or you could say one alternative to the text that they have given us. This would be the Jerusalem Bible, gives not and then not yet in a footnote. The Jerusalem Bible, the Revised Standard Version. The New English Bible, which is the old British version. And the ASV, the American Standard Version, the forefather of the New American Standard, the NASB. Okay, anything need to be repeated thus far? Okay, let's go into UPO. O-U-P-O. Not yet. So this will be your second big division now. UPO, not yet. I am not yet going to this feast, but I will, by implication, we would take it in a few days. All right, again, let's start with the manuscript evidence then. Now, we started with Aleph for ook, or not. That's as early as we go. Now, we're going to go earlier for not yet because we have some papyri manuscripts. P66, remember you write small p in a superscript. P66 and P75 are witnesses for not yet. This tests how good you can make an outline on the spur of the moment on your paper. Some of you are not doing very well from the way a shadow is on your face. A cloud is over your head. B. So now we're going to divide up Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. They do not agree on this passage. L, T, W. And then how many of you can make capital, how many of you cannot make capital Greek letters? Okay, you just write the word out then, delta. You're supposed to write if you can write capital Greek, just write it. Delta, capital Greek. Theta and psi, again to follow the popular pronunciation. That gets us through papyri manuscripts. That gets us through English enumeration of the major codices, Greek enumeration of the major codices. But we need more codices here. We don't have any more English or Greek letters, so we go into Arabic or regular English numerals prefixed with a 0. We're still talking about codices, not minuscules. 0105, 0180, 0250. Let's go beyond the codices into the minuscules. What does this mean? F1. What does that mean? First grade, someone says. Family 1 of the minuscule manuscripts. And we call them F1, and again, this is on earlier tapes. I won't bore you with those statistics again, but a whole group of minuscules are found under F1. They all seem to have, son-daughter traits of a mother or father text earlier. So we just lump them together as the F1, the whole family 1 of the minuscules. F13, those are the two famous minuscule families, F1 and F13. So F13, which may include, a dozen manuscripts under it. Number 28, number 700, 892, 1010, 1195, 1216, 1230, 1253, 1344, 1365, 1646, 2148. What I like doing when I read these numerals off is see if you can remember an important event in world history as you see these dates here. So I saw 2148 and I was wondering what would be important in that year. We're not quite there yet. And then the Byzantine lectionaries. The Byzantine lectionaries. Okay, let's go then secondly into the ancient versions or translations. It'll sound a little similar to what I just read under ook or not. And that's why I say certain, here we go, certain Old Latin manuscripts. Now some Old Latin have not yet and some have not. Certain Syriac, Coptic, that's just a repeat from ook. Gothic is new. Diatessaron, we mentioned that earlier. And then Basil, a church writer, Basil. Third place, we come to modern textual critics. Scrivener. We'll be discussing him again way later in Bible translations. We get up into the 1800s. A lot of these names will pop up. They've popped up many times in our studies already. Griesbach. He's the one who never showered in the morning. Well, that was a stupid joke. You shouldn't laugh. You should throw apples or eggs at me for that one. Lockman and Westcott and Hort. And then fourthly, modern translations. The Berkeley Living Bible, Goodspeed, Phillips, Williams, Wuest, W-U-E-S-T, and of course the KJV has not yet. And then just like with Ook, we're going to divide translations up into 1 and 2. Those just give us not yet in the text, no marginal reading to tell us that some manuscripts omit yet. So then the following versions I'm going to give you now contain not yet in the text, but then alert us to an alternative reading in the margin or in a footnote. And those would be 2 in number. The Basic English Bible. Now these aren't all translations ever done in English. These are some of the major ones, and I had time to research. There are so many of them. But these are some of the major ones. Obviously, you can tell these are the major ones somebody's reading somewhere in America, or the English-speaking world, we could say. And so that's why I've covered them. Basic English and New International Version. The New International gives not yet in the text, and if you notice down at the bottom of your page, some early manuscripts do not have yet. Whereas one like, let's say, Williams, or like the KJV, will just give us not yet in the text, and no alternative reading in the margin or in a footnote. Now, you should have all that wealth of evidence now on a whole page or 2 before you. And here's what I have to say about what I've just given you. What is rather surprising in a case like this is to see how the manuscripts, Greek editors, modern translations, and so forth are so equally divided over which variant to accept as the correct one. Look at your material there. You have almost an equal number of each classification that I've just given you. And I didn't try to do that on purpose. That's just the way it is. It balances itself out. You've got X number of manuscripts representing Ook and about the same number that represent Upo.
For the continuation of
You've got X number of manuscripts representing Ook and about the same number that represent Upo. Same for church fathers and early translations, the same for the modern textual critics, and essentially the same for modern recent translations of the Bible. Of course, I jumped back in history to grab the KJV. It's not a modern or recent one, but it's still a well-known and popular one that's much in use today. So what is very surprising in a case like this is to see how well-balanced the evidence it is. Yeah. Generally, you have it pretty much weighted in one direction or the other, so you just go in that direction. And most of the time, it's weighted contrary to the TR, the Textus Receptus, which essentially to us anyway means the KJV. And so you just opt in favor of that. But then the NIV, which is a new translation, gives us as its textual reading in the text the same reading as the KJV, which comes from Byzantine lectionaries, which sounds like TR text to me, although Byzantine and TR are not synonymous with one another. So it's very surprising to see this to be the case. As well as the point I alluded to earlier, that 01 and 03, the 2 great famous early mid-4th century Greek codices, witnesses to the New Testament text, are divided as far as their witness is concerned for this passage. I go on. Generally, the balance is clearly in one direction. The editors of the United Bible Society's 3rd edition corrected of the Greek New Testament, which is the most popular Greek Bible in print today, most reliable. The editors, so this is important to get this down, the editors of UBS, just write UBS 3rd ED corrected. And then I'll know what you mean when I read your notes. The editors of UBS 3rd edition corrected go with, which one do you think they're going to go with? They're going to say, ask that church in Poultney about this matter.
There we go.
They go with ook, not. But, I forget what rating. I think they give it a C. I'm sorry I didn't copy that down. They have an A, B, C, D rating. So it's probably a C because I go on in my paper to say, but they state there is considerable doubt over which one is correct. So whenever in other words, whenever UBS gives, let's say a D, which is as low a ranking as they can give, then it's pretty much up for grabs whenever they give a D. When they give a C, it's questionable. If they give an A, it's certainly follow them. And B, almost always follow them. And C and D, as you can see, you get on down the scale. So the editors give us ook. They go with that. Not. I do not. I am not going to this feast. But I think they give it a C, B, C, D rating, probably a C, and state there is considerable doubt over which is correct. Okay, that gives you the textual evidence. Now let's get into a study of what the textual evidence means then. And I'll start that study with this question. What could have caused such a variant problem? And I'm hoping that you're smart enough to give me an answer to that. You think about it as you write. Scribal error. What could have caused such a variant problem? Why so equally divided here, though? Okay, let me go on then. Let's assume that not yet was in the text. Someone changed something somewhere along the line. That's obvious. John didn't say not yet. He didn't say both of them. He said one or the other. Let's assume not yet is in the text. What would have caused someone to ever invent not? To make it look like he lied. Okay, now that would be virtually non-existent as far as the copyists and scribes of the New Testament would go. They would never try to introduce that. So that's really not an answer. Got another one?
They inserted it to make it look more religious.
To make it look more religious.
Well, I forget what you call it, but
Yeah.
they insert things to make it fit into their doctrine.
Okay. But what they're generally trying to do is help us out as far as orthodoxy is concerned. And they're going to present a problem by giving us that. You see, they're going to create more confusion than they're going to deliver us from. If it says not yet, well, that's what we would understand anyways, not yet. Then if they say not, they're destroying our orthodoxy then. Let's reverse the situation. Let's say, and this is the way we really should study it, because that's virtually impossible to answer. If not yet was in the text, why would we ever have not then invented? Okay, let's assume that not was originally in the text. That not, I am not going to this feast. Then help me explain why we would ever come up with not yet.
To show that Jesus did not lie.
Yeah, to explain the difficulty for us then. All right. What could have caused such a variant problem? See, if you start thinking like that, you hypothesize one or the other into the text and ask yourself, what would have caused the origin or the birth of the alternative? Then it helps you get thinking, and before you know it, you've already got the answer, which one's original. What could have caused such a variant problem? In the 3rd century, the heretic Porphyry, the one I just given you before, Porphyry, P-O-R-P-H-Y-R-Y, used this verse, which in his Greek New Testament had not, ook, used this verse to show that Jesus lied. In Jerome's work, we have his comments preserved. Perhaps then this, and there was a big stir over that and a big argument in Jerome's writings between what Jerome had to say and what Porphyry had to say. And I state, perhaps then this is what caused the introduction of the variant upo, not yet, into later translations or later editions of the Greek text. Are you following me thus far? Some have suggested that since the implication is clearly not yet, that's one point of theirs, and since the manuscript evidence for that variant is no small voice, then the upo should be accepted. Now, I'll go over this again. They're claiming 2 points here. Some have suggested that since the implication is clearly not yet. In other words, let me perform this for you. Let's just say we're reading along here. Let's say that the word should be not, that yet really shouldn't be in there. We're reading along. Jesus said, I am not going to this feast because for me the right time has not yet come. Having said this, he stayed in Galilee. However, after his brothers had left for the feast, he went also, not publicly but in secret. Well, probably we wouldn't have a big problem with that. We would just say, well, I mean, when he said, I go not, sometimes we would say that, I'm not going outside. But we just mean I'm not going out right now, that I'll go out later. And after all, didn't he then, right after that, go on to say, because for me the right time has not yet come. Amen. Again, a clear twofold implication that the right time shall come in a moment or a day or two or a week or two, and then I'll go on up, whether to the feast or Jerusalem or Judea or whatever. So they have suggested that the implication is clearly, regardless of whether we accept upo or uk, the implication is clearly not yet. And secondly, they argue, since the manuscript evidence for that voice is for that variant is no small voice, which is true, then upo should be accepted as genuine, and uk discounted as spurious. Then my counter-argument is, but there are two well-known rules of textual criticism that might seem to militate against this. Their points are the implication is not yet and manuscript evidence. Well, manuscript evidence is really not in their favor because we have that in our favor too. The uk people and the upo have manuscript evidence, translations, Greek editors. Everyone has everyone in favor of their side. So that's really nothing. Their argument may seem to be weighty here for the moment anyway, that not yet, upo is clearly the implication, regardless of whether we accept upo or uk as being original or genuine in the text. My counter-argument will be twofold. I say that there are two well-known rules of textual criticism that might seem to militate against this. Number one, what can you think? Let's jump into let's see, what's the first one I give you? Oh yeah, let's jump back into the text. You're going to have to read this. Think of some of those rules. Some of you have already mentioned a few of the rules of textual criticism. I don't know that no one has touched on the first one that I'm bringing forth here in just a moment, here in the paper. But look at, well, just verse 8 is all we need. Look at verse 8. See if you can see there the background for what scholars later drew up as rules or principles of textual criticism that might help us answer whether we should have uk or upo. Okay, that's, we need to go on to something else. Okay, let me stay with our sisters first of all. There's nothing wrong with that, but just the omission of one word probably, as far as I know, no one would ever use that rule of textual criticism for this verse because you only have one word. The difference is one word. You got to have something longer where you could tell some scribe came along and really added in a lot of material here. Because it's not the addition of and generally when they add, they're trying to add like liturgical material in. And they're really not trying to do that. Okay, and I'm hearing from several different people about the more difficult, but still, just staying with this verse, just verse 8, there's one that's one of those not as well known, but just happens all the time that you haven't seemed to notice yet. Okay, what's that called? Ditography. The second, or maybe first, but in NIV, let's call it the second, upo is genuine. Do you notice that you have two not yets in the same verse? You have two not yets. Now that second not yet, at the end of this verse, is found in all the manuscripts. No problems with that not yet. Now what ditography says is that the scribe, as he's looking back up, sees something twice whenever it really only appears once. Or you have haplography, the reverse of that. He sees something once that really needs to be seen twice because it really was found there twice. Now, since we know that there's a lot of dispute about the first upo and no dispute about the second one, then I would argue that we probably have a case of dittography on our hands here. The scribe looked up from his copy back to the exemplar and saw what he thought to be two cases of not yet upo, when in fact there was only one. In other words, as he's starting off this verse, I am not yet going up to this feast, he looks over in his exemplar and he's at the end of this verse, has not yet come, and puts the not yet in there. And he goes on, because for me the right time, and he copies that, and then he looks back to his exemplar again, has not yet come. And now he sees the not yet come where it should be and places it here. But he places it there on two occasions when it should only be found once. So my first point, there is a valid, legitimate upo at the end of this verse, and the eyes of the copyist may well have seen this twice, when really it only appeared once in the manuscript before him. Two well-known rules. The second rule, as you've already suggested, it is generally best to take the more difficult of two variants. Now that almost invariably is the first rule of textual criticism, is take the more difficult of the two. For inevitably, a later copyist would attempt to smooth out the harsher of the two variants. He would hardly ever introduce a harsh one for us and create a problem unless it was by an accident of dittography, homoiotolute, hoplography, and all these other things that we've given you before. So it's generally the best practice, the best rule to follow, to take the more difficult of two variants. And that, of course, assumes that the more difficult is not something just totally outrageous. If he said, I am Santa Claus going up to this feast, well, that's a variant, all right, Santa Claus. But that's so outrageous, of course, no one would even suggest that. So some people take that to an extreme, and they just want you to take the most difficult thing you can find. Take the most difficult as long as it makes sense. Don't take something absurd. So I'll go over those 2 points again. There is a valid, legitimate upo at the end of this verse, and the eyes of the copyist may well have seen this twice, called dittography. Secondly, it is generally best to take the more difficult of two variants. That would be ook over upo. It's easy to explain upo, not yet. He's not yet gone. It's more difficult to explain ook. So we take generally, not always true, but most of the time, you take the more difficult of two variants, for inevitably a later copyist would attempt to smooth out the harsher of the variants. Okay, let's continue on then. If yet, you're getting a whole lesson in how you employ these skills in a textual criticism. And really all you have to do is just stop yourself when you see that you've got two cases here, yet and just plain not, and without opting immediately for this second rule of textual criticism and say, well, I'm going to take the hardest one right away. Just hypothesize either one of those, both of those, one at a time in the text, and ask yourself, what would have caused the birth of the additional alternative? What would have caused the origin of that? If we already have not yet, how would anyone ever have invented not? They're creating problems for us with that. If someone had not in there originally, well, we can easily see how someone would invent not yet, because they would smooth out that harsh reading so we can move right into the fact that, in fact, Jesus did go to the Feast of Tabernacles a few days hence. If yet was in the text, then how could it ever have been taken out, since that is just what would produce the alleged contradiction between Jesus' words and actions? By taking yet out, that would produce the contradiction. So, our conclusion is, it appears best to take ook, not, as the correct variant. Therefore, Jesus said, I go not up to this feast. So, I would mark out the NIV. I do not know why they went with that. But I believe from all the evidence I've given you tonight that what they give in the margin is correct. And that is the omission of the word yet. I see, we take the burden of proof on ourselves because we're creating a difficulty for ourselves to do that. If we leave it not yet, we jump over this passage and have no problem at all. And you may want to also note, of course, that you need to change this omit the yet in your KJV Bible. It'll have the same thing there. So KJV would have, I go not up to this feast. NIV would have, I am not going up to this feast. And I can't think of anyone anywhere that can dispute that. And why they accepted that, I really don't know. But it was the easy way out. You'd have to write a whole commentary on what they thought that it meant if you leave upo out and take uk. Jesus said, I go not up to this feast. But later we see that he did. How may this be explained? Many views have been espoused over the centuries, and to those views we now come. Now we've settled it textually, as far as I'm concerned, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that yet should be omitted. See, I don't even have it marked out in this Bible yet, but I already knew what it should be. I'm sure it's marked out in my faithful version, my trustworthy one. I've made it trustworthy in those places where I've studied. How may this be explained? Many views have been espoused over the centuries. So now we're going to ask ourselves the question, how are we going to deal with this? We created a problem for ourselves now by taking yet out. So obviously either we're trying to be honest or we're ignorant, one or the other. Let's look at some answers here. Now I've got them, I think, by paragraph. Let's hope they're by paragraph. You're supposed to have one theme per paragraph. I don't always do that. I get writing and just never start a new paragraph. So let's start with number 1 here. My paper won me 5,000, so it must have been okay, though. Okay, let's start with number 1. Not a few have suggested that the clear implication of the text would have us supply in our mind the word yet or now, even assuming that ook is correct. Therefore, it becomes not a textual question, but a question of interpretation. In other words, we've got many people who would assume, all right, if you've proven all of that to me, or maybe you're even at that position right now. This is a first and a popular position, all right? We've just proven that yet should not be there, all right? I just took that out. In other words, Jesus never said that, and John never wrote that. But whether John wrote it or Jesus said it, couldn't Jesus have implied that? So we would have, I am not going up to this feast, and we would have supplied in our mind the sense of the passage, I am not yet going to this feast, or I'm not going to this feast now, at this time. The implication being I will go later. So here's our first solution, a first view espoused many centuries ago by Augustine. He was the first to espouse this view. Assuming that ook is genuine, upo is spurious, all right? We'll take ook as the text, but upo as the implication. Not a few have suggested that the clear implication of the text would have us supply in our mind the word yet or now. Augustine said that he simply meant he would not go up on that particular day in which his brother spoke. Augustine, the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, Homilies on the Gospel of John, Volume 7, page 181. Chrysostom said in his writing that now, in quotation marks, that now was implied. Chrysostom said in his writing that now was implied. Chrysostom, Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, Homilies on John, Volume 14, and page 174. Now, what do you think about this solution? Is that a possible alternative solution? We have our corrected text, so don't even think about the word yet as being in the text now. Is this a possible alternative solution? I am not going up to the feast because the right time has not yet come. He just means I'm not going up to the feast right now, on the day in which his brother spoke. My next sentence, it is true that, quote, not yet, end of quote, can be implied in a passage even when the word yet does not appear. You don't have to have yet in the text, and the implication can still be not yet. Let's look at a couple of examples. We'll stay in John 8 and 15. John 8 and 15. The other one is Psalm 139:16, better brought out in the KJV, just for point of comparison. Psalm 139:16. We're not going to look that one up, but Psalm 139:16. David's praising God for, the fact that God knew him even in his mother's womb, and he said, "When as yet none of my members were formed." Well, how could, and yet is supplied in italics in the King James Version, because maybe that's the implication there. But we don't need that. We just need John 8:15. Now watch this. See if we don't have an implication of yet, even though you don't have upo in the passage. "You judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one." Now, how absolute is that statement, "I pass judgment on no one"? Well, I think that we read earlier, for instance, in John 5 and verse 22, that the Father has committed all judgment into the hands of the Son. So what he means here is, I judge no one yet. There's going to come a final day when he does judge everyone. So he doesn't say yet here, but that's the implication, that he's not going to judge anyone right now. He's going to judge everyone on a final eschatological day of judgment. So we can have a verse that omits yet, but implies it. And that would be the argument for John 7 and 8. It is true that not yet can be implied in a passage even when the word yet does not appear. Cf. John 8:15, Psalm 139:16. But it seems as though the correct meaning lies in another area, and that yet is not really the stressed implication of this verse. Now are you following me? Now we put ourselves in two difficulties. We took yet out of the text, we took yet out of the implication as well. That's really not what he's implying when he says, "I go not up." Now he can't just mean, "I go not up," because he went up. So he can't just mean that. There has to be something else here. And he can't, I don't think, he doesn't mean, "I go not up yet." And anyway, we get that later in the verse when he says, "My time is not yet come." Here's a second suggestion, another alternative solution to this problem. This comes from the writings of H.A.W. Meyer in his commentaries. And this is why we're studying under our fourth point of clarification. Meyer said that our Lord had a change of purpose after stating this, as in the case of the Syrophoenician woman of Matthew 15. Now remember, this is our fourth point of clarification. Truth is compatible with a change of intention, behavior, and action. So when Jesus said this, he didn't mean, "I'm not going up yet," thinking that he's going to go shortly. As far as he could think at that moment, he was just not ever going to this feast. And then, wouldn't it be okay for a few days later for him to change his mind and then go up? Well, certainly. We've already proved that, and he wouldn't be guilty of lying, would he? If he fully intended not to go, see, we don't have the yet implication here. That's Augustine's view. That's Dr. Freeman's view, and KJV's view, and NIV's view, whether they have in the text or implication. That's their view. This isn't that view. This is a different view now. We don't have yet in the text or in the implication. We have Jesus fully intending not to go to the feast, period. And then a few days later, he changes his mind. And Meyer compares this to the Syrophoenician woman in Mark 7 and Matthew 15. How do we get the comparison? Didn't Jesus essentially say, when the woman asked for healing, Jesus said no? Well, did he ever end up healing the lady? Well, he did. Or her daughter, remember, cast the demon out of her daughter. Well, did he lie? No, he changed his mind. He said no. She kept pressing. He saw her faith. He said, "Then for you it's yes. Be it unto thee according to thy faith." So he finds that analogous to what we have here in John 7:8. That's Meyer, Commentary on the New Testament, Volume 3, page 233. This is perfectly acceptable as far as morals are concerned, and would therefore fit properly under this fourth clarification we presently are studying. I don't think that it's the answer, though. So we're only studying it here because it could fit here if Meyer's view is right.
Behold, how pleasant and how
how good it is.